Good afternoon. I'm uploading my video now. Thanks again for your patience as I navigate the technological issues in making this class hybrid. I hope you've had a good first week and that you're all healthy and safe. I'd like to have our final class today dedicated to the idea of culture. Let me just make a few announcements. After this lecture, I will be posting a discussion assignment that will go with it that I'll ask that you complete by at some point this weekend. I'll give you the specific date after you've watched this video. There will also be reading assignments and viewing assignments for Monday's class, which will have to do with the first culture or society that we're going to look at, which is Stone Age society, and the cultural form that we'll be looking at in connection to that will be Stone Age art and Stone Age cave paintings. That will be what we start on Monday. Remember the basic format for this class. There's a Monday group, which comes to class on Monday and then has online assignments on Wednesday and Friday. A Wednesday group, which has an online assignment on Monday, comes to class on Wednesday, and then another online assignment on Friday. And then remember, there's a few of you who are quarantining or for other reasons will be doing all of this online, at least for the time being. So, and also, by the way, I would just say, please feel free to give me feedback about how you think the course is going, how the lectures are working, and so on. So today what I'd like to do is to have sort of the second leg of our discussion about the idea of culture, which has to do, or which will relate to the thought of a German philosopher whose name is Ernst Cassirer, who wrote this book called An Idea of Man, which I'll be talking about shortly. And then also I'll be introducing a concept that we will refer to on a regular basis throughout this class called the hermeneutic circle. Let's just remind ourselves briefly of what we talked about on Wednesday's class. On Wednesday's class, we considered the ideas of Raymond Williams as laid out in his essay on culture, in which he did an etymology, sort of historical etymology of the word culture, meaning he looked at the way that the word culture has evolved over time from its roots in Latin to the way that it got carried over into various European languages, including English. And the first thing that we talked about is his point that the term was originally a word for referring to agriculture and to certain types of agricultural tools, but that at a certain point, sometime in the 1500s and 1600s, at least in English, the term started to be used metaphorically as a way of talking about things that could be done to the human mind. What was specifically being compared was the way that one could cultivate a field, enrich a field through agriculture, to the way that one could cultivate or enrich the mind through education, reading, exposure to art, and so on. Once that occurred, Williams argued that three distinct meanings emerged in English. Culture could refer to the process of human development, i.e. the shift from a state of savagery to one of culture, and in this context, the word means something very similar to civilization. It could also mean, and this is the one that all of you are most familiar with, interestingly enough, a particular way of life of a people, period, or group. And I would say with that, the forms of expression that are distinct to that group as well. This is why we talk, for example, about folk music or folk tales. Those are seen as forms of culture that are unique to the term culture when it's understood as relating to a particular group or people, and specifically to what in some Germanic languages is called a folk. Remember, folk in English and in other Germanic languages is simply a word for people. And finally, it can refer to intellectual and artistic activity understood as particularly difficult or demanding or respected forms of intellectual and artistic activity, what we sometimes call high culture, to distinguish it from pop culture or popular culture. Today we're going to look at a different take on the idea of culture, but I don't think it's one that is the opposite of Williams' ideas, but it sort of tries to provide a philosophical understanding of what the word culture really means and what it relates to us as human beings. How does culture fit into an understanding of the kinds of creatures that human beings fundamentally are? And I think to answer that question, or to understand what these thinkers are getting at when they ask this question, we should think about, I think we should ask the following question. How do we acquire knowledge of cultural objects such as texts, art, etc.? So when you talk about someone who has an understanding, say, of music, or someone who has an understanding of literature, an understanding of the art of making films or videos, what are we talking about? What does it mean to have knowledge of things like books, movies, art, and so on? Because I think in a certain sense that's an important question we're asking in this class. And a way to sort of think about what I'm asking here is to contrast it to a different type of knowledge. For example, how do we acquire knowledge of a chemical compound? And I suppose the first thing, so think about that for a moment. How do we acquire knowledge of something like a chemical compound? If we wanted to reach an understanding of a chemical compound, what would that involve? Think about that for a moment. Now, obviously we don't have a chance to really discuss that amongst ourselves, but it would probably involve carrying out experiments which would give us very precise, what's sometimes called objective, positivistic, empirical knowledge of the properties of that compound. There would be very clear right or wrong answers relating to the physical characteristics of the compound that we are investigating. Now, how is that different from acquiring knowledge of something like this? So if you look at this, what we immediately understand it as being, I think, is, obviously you would say, a painting. But what does that mean? How is that different from the chemical compound? Well, I would suggest that one of the things that we immediately and implicitly understand is that this is man-made or human-made. This is the product or outcome of deliberate, at least at some level, human action and human choice. And you might also say that it is an outcome of human expression. Expression is a difficult word, but it means something like the idea that we have an idea or belief inside of us, and then we find a way to bring it outside of us by placing it usually in some kind of physical grounding or object or basis that is understood as being symbolic. Okay? So I would say that, first of all, this is different because we understand it to be human-made in a way that a chemical compound is not primarily. I mean, I suppose you could argue that a chemical compound could be certainly artificial and thus human-made, but in terms of the basic things that it consists of, they're not human-made, or they're at least not expressive. So we understand this is human-made, and we understand it as having sort of symbolic meanings. And I guess I would say that the big difference here in the former, we are gauging, we are determining objective physical properties. In this case, we are doing something like decoding. I would argue that understanding a painting is a lot like translating. It's a lot like taking words that we know are in a different language and converting them into words that we understand. An activity of decoding. And I think the theme of today's class is that an important way of understanding what it means to have knowledge of culture is that it is an act of decoding. Okay. Interpretation might be another way of saying it, but I'm going to use the term decoding for now. So that, I would say, is the difference between these two types of activities. And what I'm really getting at here is the idea that that there are different types of knowledge. I think you understand that, but it's worth pondering. There's the kind of knowledge that we pursue, that you pursue when you're in a biology class, a chemistry class, physics class, a geography class. And then there's the kind of knowledge that you pursue when you're in a history class, an English class, a philosophy class, and so on. And I would say that often, not always, but often in those latter categories that we call the humanities or social sciences, we are talking about a kind of knowledge of cultural objects that means decoding, or that involves decoding or interpretation. So let's talk then about some particular takes on this idea of cultural knowledge, or the understanding of cultural objects as decoding or interpretation, and more generally the idea that what culture really refers to is symbolic activity. So let me say a word or two about this philosopher, a German philosopher, named Ernst Cassirer. He's a 20th century German philosopher. You can see a picture of him here with his sort of shock of dramatic white hair. He was a German philosopher who did eventually, during the Second World War, come to the United States, and who died here at a time when he was teaching at Columbia University in New York City. I won't tell you much more about him, but one important feature of his work was an attempt simply to understand human nature, and in the process of understanding human nature, to emphasize the importance of symbolism to human beings and to sort of human existence. He sought to show that humans could not simply be understood by biological definitions alone. And if you read the chapters or the section of the that I gave you, which is based on this idea of a clue to human nature, a clue to the nature of man, the symbol, he basically argues that each biological species has its own distinct characteristics, possibly its own world and form of knowledge. And he then goes on to suggest that human beings are no different. They are their own species. We are a kind of animal, he believes, that, but we have our own distinct characteristics. And one of the distinctive characteristics of the animal that is the human being, Cassirer believes, is the fact that we are animals that engage in a large amount of symbolic activity. So let's think about this. What is Cassirer getting at? Humans, he argues, are not simply creatures that receive stimuli, meaning sort of signals from the outside world that their organism responds to or reacts to. We certainly do that. When we get cold, that produces a physiological reaction. When we experience fear in our immediate environment, that produces a physiological reaction. So we're similar to other animals in that respect. But Cassirer maintains that there is, and again, you never have to believe any of this. We're simply just sort of considering interesting theories. Cassirer believes that one characteristic of human beings is that in addition to receiving and responding to external stimuli, we are also symbol creators. If you look at the object in the picture here. This is one that we're going to be talking about in a few weeks. It's actually a clay patty dried in the sun that has markings on it from a reed stylus. Something that almost all of us can immediately understand, even if we have no idea what the meaning of this object is that it would appear to be some form of symbolic activity, possibly even writing. And this is the key point that Cassirer makes. Human beings are symbol creators. Human beings are constantly creating symbols. I would suggest, I wish I could illustrate this actually in class, that this is precisely what we are doing right now. At some level, when you're watching this video, you do realize that you are seeing an image of a man who is bobbing his head around in certain ways and making noises with his mouth. From a strictly physiological point of view, that of course is what I am doing. At the same time, you are also hearing me or understanding that I am engaging in symbolic activity. I am forming sounds that make up words that are part of sentences that add up, hopefully, to ideas. That is symbolic activity. At the same time, you are participating in that because you are decoding my symbolic activity. So there's something physiological that is certainly going on here, but there is also something, Cassirer would argue, that is cultural, because I am producing symbols, I am encoding meaning into symbols, and you are, at almost as fast as I am doing that, decoding the very symbols that I am creating. And Cassirer's point is, this is what culture is, and culture in this sense is a distinctive characteristic of the animal that is human beings. Cassirer says, symbols transform the whole of human life. As soon as we engage in symbolic activity, there is a layer to human life, or a dimension of human life, that cannot be understood strictly in physiological terms. No one understands a movie simply as a kind of flashing back and forth of various forms of light. No one understands music simply as sound. No one understands writing simply as markings on a page. We understand all of that activity as symbolic, and it only is understandable as symbolic activity and can't be reduced simply to the physical properties that constitute it. Which leads Cassirer to argue that compared to other animals, man lives not merely in a broader reality, he lives in a new dimension of reality. No longer in a merely physical universe, man lives in a symbolic universe. This symbolic universe, Cassirer argues, consists, you might say, of several distinct regions. Simply from Cassirer's point of view, although I think he makes a good point, there are four main regions of symbolic activity, you might say. Four main kinds of symbolic activity. There's language, which of course is what I am doing with the sounds that I'm making with my mouth right now, or what I have done in typing characters into PowerPoint slides. He also thinks myth is an example of that, by which he means something like stories we tell about how things are. I'd say that you could describe myth as a particular kind of storytelling, a particular kind of narrative. It also includes art in all of its different forms. I'm showing a famous painting by the Italian Renaissance artist Botticelli right here. So here we have, an element of representation using paint and so on. But music would certainly count as that as well. Theater, dance, etc. And religion. So I'm not asking that you accept this idea that these are the four main forms of symbolic activity, but for Cassirer, they are. And I would say, though, however, that Cassire's definition is a pretty good example of the kind of symbolic or cultural activities we're going to be looking at this semester. He also makes this point that that because we are because we are symbol creators, the world in which we live is fundamentally symbolic. Cassire makes the interesting and provocative claim that we never live in a completely physical world. If you think about the dorm rooms or the apartment rooms from which you might even be watching this, I am sure some of you have posters on your wall. I am sure some of you have photographs of loved ones on your walls. I'm sure that you've thought at least a little bit about sort of the decoration of the room that you're in. Cassire's point is that none of that can be understood simply in terms of physical properties. All of that has a cultural or symbolic definition. So he makes this kind of interesting idea that the more we engage in symbolic activity, the more sort of layered it's in symbolic reality we are. We're almost kind of like, if you imagine us kind of lying on a bed, it's a little bit like the old sort of Princess and the Pea story, if you remember that fairy tale. The sort of the blanket or comforter that is symbolism gets thicker and thicker and thicker over time, and we have less and less kind of direct connection, he suggests, with actual physical reality. So he says this when he argues physical reality seems to recede in proportion as man's symbolic activity advances. Instead of dealing with the things themselves, man is constantly conversing with himself. Why conversing with himself? Because what he means is we are always in the process of decoding the symbols of other people. Every time you read an email, every time you follow an instruction manual, anytime you're on the road and reading signs, you are, according to Cassire, conversing with yourself insofar as you are decoding the symbols of other human beings. So the way that I suggest that we think about what Cassire is saying about culture is that objects that we call cultural are really symbolic. I guess I am saying that for Cassire, the definition of culture is symbolic activity, human symbolic activity. Language, music, religion, and literature are all cultural because they're all symbolic. And the way that I would describe symbolic activity is that it has two parts to it. This is very important. It means both encoding and decoding. Encoded objects have meaning. Let me see if I can sort of explain this. All culture is like an emoji, you could say, a smiley face. What do we understand about a smiley face? It has been encoded. When we see that symbol, and an emoji is a pretty good example of a symbol, we understand that it has been sort of selected to bear within it, to hold within it, to contain within it the meaning happy. And each time we see it, we go through an extremely rapid process, but a real process of decoding it. We see the sort of symbol, and we translate it in our minds to the meaning that was originally encoded into it. So there's always sort of a two-part activity going on in symbolic activity of encoding meaning into symbols and then taking the symbol and decoding them back into the meaning. Okay, that is what symbolic activity fundamentally is for Cassire. And I would suggest that the way to think about the cultural world that we inhabit is that it is like a world of emojis. When we go to a party and start talking to people, when we go to a new country and have to deal with an unfamiliar world, when we watch a movie or read a book or listen to music, we are inhabiting a cultural world in which we are dealing with encoded symbols that have meaning and attempting, usually, perhaps often successfully, but not always, of decoding them. What we mean by confusion often is difficulty decoding meaning. So I want to talk then about another theme, which is the idea of the hermeneutic circle. This is articulated by different philosophers, and you watched a video about this. And the short version is, even though this is not Cassirer's idea, I'm going to make the point that it's very closely connected to his notion of culture as symbols, and symbolic activity as the encoding and decoding of meaning. The hermeneutic circle is an idea we can use for thinking about how we're going to approach the books from the past that we're going to read this semester. Very, very simply, the very basic point that I would make is ancient books that we're going to be reading this semester, like the Epic of Gilgamesh, or Confucius's Analects, are encoded meanings. If you look at the picture that I'm showing you right here, again, you don't know what it is, but you can probably tell that it is some kind of slab of stone that has inscriptions in it. What this in fact is a very, if I'm not mistaken, is a very early version of the book that we're going to be reading this semester. This is an early version of the Epic of Gilgamesh. And when we look at it, we say, wow, I don't understand that. But that triggers an activity that we are going to, in various ways, going to try and engage in this semester, which is interpretation. And I would say, and I would just point out, the term hermeneutic is a slightly complicated or specialized philosophical term that means simply interpretation. And interpretation means, I would say, decoding. So hermeneutics means interpretation. Interpretation means decoding. So another way to think about what the hermeneutic circle is, it's sort of the circle of encoding and decoding, if you will. So back to the basic idea. Back to emojis, rather. What is the hermeneutic circle from the standpoint of the emoji? The basic concept of the hermeneutic circle is this. Let me just sort of state it briefly. It's that when we understand symbolic activity or cultural activity, we are always sort of going back and forth between two perspectives. We are always interpreting a part of something in terms of the whole, and we are always interpreting the whole in terms of the part. What does this mean? It means that we need to understand the idea of a smiley face before we can understand that the dots and the emoji mean the eyes. You can't really understand the symbolic significance of an emoji, of how it's trying to encode the idea of a smiley face until you know something about, until you've actually had the experience of a human face smiling. So in that sense, I think you could say we need the idea of a whole to interpret the part. But the part also helps us to understand the whole. When we understand the smiley face emoji, we can then understand other emojis as well. So the hermeneutic circle shows us that we arrive at a better understanding of the part the more that we understand the whole. And the way that I'm going to sort of make this point in class is one way to understand what the whole is the bigger culture that something is a part of. So you need to understand something about the bigger cultural picture that any particular cultural object comes from. To go back to the example of an emoji, you can't really understand an emoji and why they matter and why they've become important if you don't understand that they are just one little part of what you might call digital culture, cell phones, social media, tech speak, and so on. So we're going to use the hermeneutic circle in this class. And here, let me just give you and we'll enrich this idea and return to this idea over the course of the semester. I want to just sort of lodge a very basic understanding of the term in your minds for now. What we'll do in class is we'll often start with what I'm going to call a part. That is, one single cultural artifact from a past society. So for example, if you look to the right, we're going to start on Monday with those paintings. Those are just one limited single example of a cultural object, a form of expression from a society from tens of thousands of years ago. It's not the whole society, it is just a part. We will try to interpret it, and one way that we'll try to interpret it is seeing how we can reach a better understanding of this part if we see it as connected to the bigger whole, which is all that we know about the society of the time that produced this particular painting. And I'm going to use this term, the historical context, which means something kind of like the broader society, the broader historical picture. So the historical context, or the whole, will help us understand the part. If we know more about this particular Stone Age society, perhaps we can understand more about this particular painting. But it's important to remember that the hermeneutic circle is a circle. One thing leads to the other, and then the other leads back to the one thing. The whole helps us understand the part, but in turn, the part helps us understand the whole. So the text, i.e. the painting, will also help us better understand the culture. The understanding doesn't just go one way. Yes, understanding the society helps us understand the painting, but in turn, the painting also tells us things about the society that perhaps other elements of the society don't inform us about. I would also say that another way of thinking about the hermeneutic circle is not just in terms of the whole versus part. That's what the scholar whose video you watched emphasized. But there's another aspect to it that I think is just important, which is what I call the relationship between the familiar and the strange. And I really think the whole and the part aspect and the familiar and strange aspect are connected and really two different versions of the same thing, but I want to make sure that I phrase it this way too. Another way to think of the hermeneutic circle is that the first step of knowledge is relating relating something new to the familiar. Okay, if you go to a country that you haven't been to before, and someone goes like this, shakes their head that way, you probably understand that. You probably recognize that as familiar, and assume that that means no, a negative. That's going to be your first understanding, because what you are doing there is connecting a symbolic expression to a code or meaning that you're familiar with. But you might learn, precisely because that's familiar to you, you might learn that that means, in this particular society, the opposite of what it customarily means in the society that you're familiar with. Perhaps in this particular society, it actually means yes. Okay? And I guess the idea, so it's something unusual to you, in fact, not what's familiar. So the idea of the hermeneutic circle, in addition to using the whole to understand the part and then the part to understand the whole, can also mean that you use the familiar to have a clearer understanding of what's strange or unusual, but that in turn, over time, you can make the strange and the unusual more familiar to you. So cultural interpretation, you could say, is about making things that seem familiar strange, and then making things that seem strange familiar. Maybe once we understand Stone Age cave painting, as much as we need to understand how different their society is from ours, perhaps there are certain basic ways in which we can see them maybe going about similar concerns or similar fears or similar anxieties as our own in different ways. And that can be understood as an act of making the strange familiar. And I would say that perhaps the basic hope, if you will, of cultural knowledge in disciplines like history and literature and philosophy that examine culture is that we can have some kind of understanding of things that are very foreign and remote from us. I hope that's an idea that we can explore in this class. So that concludes my lecture for today. Let me just say a word or two about how I plan to proceed. I'm going to upload this, and after that, I will be sending out either a discussion forum via just a written discussion forum as I've done in the past, or I'm going to try something called Flipgrid, which allows you to record video reactions, but I'm not sure that I have that working yet, so that might have to wait until next week. But there is going to be a response to this lecture that I will have you do, and when I send out an email, I will make sure that I'm clear about when I want you to do that by, and also note that there will be a reading viewing assignment in addition to that for Monday. Have a good weekend. Be in touch with me if you have any questions, and please remember, I am always happy to sort of virtually meet any of you via Zoom. I've enjoyed our first week together, even if it's a little bit remote, and I look forward to next week. Take care.